Dapper has been a highly requested topic on my channel, so I'm finally delivering a video. Today we're going to create a simple CRUD API using the Dapper micro-ORM and SQL Server as our database. So let's dive in. I'm starting from a blank solution because we're going to be building our API from scratch. So the first step is going to be to add a web API project. So I'm going to say add new project, and I'm going to pick ASP.NET Core Web API. Let's give it a simple name of web.api and let's click next. I'm going to uncheck Docker because I'm not going to be using it, and I'll also uncheck use controllers because I want to be using minimal APIs for my endpoints. I'm going to leave enable OpenAPI support because I want to be using Swagger for my user interface where I will easily be able to test my endpoints. So let's create our new web API project. And let's see what we're going to do next. Out of the box, we're going to get this program.cs file. I'm going to start by removing these comments because I don't need them. And I'm also going to get rid of the weather forecast endpoint and the respective weather forecast class. So this is what we are left with, the boilerplate minimal API in .NET 7. The next thing we need to do is to install Dapper and our database client. So let me go through our NuGet packages. And I'm going to first look for Dapper. There it is. I'm going to install this library, and this is going to be our micro-ORM that we're going to use to write queries to our database. Next, I'm going to look for SQL Client. I'm going to install the Microsoft Data SQL Client NuGet package because this is the newer version for SQL Server and it's going to be the recommended one going forward. So this is the one I'll be installing. And with our NuGet packages in place, we can move on to the next step. I mentioned that I'm going to be using SQL Server for my database, and I already have a database in place. I'm going to be using the customers table, which has just a few columns, and this will be enough for our CRUD example. SQL Server is running locally on my machine, and I'm going to connect to this database through my web API, and we're going to query this table and implement the CRUD operations. So let's start by adding the connection string to the web API project. I'm going to add the connection string in the app settings development JSON file. I'm going to create a new section, which I will call connection strings, and let's add the default connection string, and this is the value that it's going to have. It's going to point to my localhost SQL Server instance, and the database that we're connecting to is going to be called eShop. With the connection string in place, we're going to need a class to represent our table in the database. So let me create a new folder here, which is going to contain my database models, and let's call it models. I'm going to add a new class inside, which is going to represent my customer, and let's add a few properties to our customer entity. So first I'm going to need an ID, then I'm going to need a few string properties for the first name and the last name. Then I'm going to need a string property to represent the email. So let me adjust the name of this property. And I'll also need a date time property for the date of birth of this customer. So date time, and I'm going to give it the name of date of birth. And now we are ready to write our first query using Dapper. So let's create an endpoint to query all of the customers from the database and return them from our API. I'll head over to the program file, and I'm going to start simple by calling map-get. This is how you can define a get endpoint with minimal APIs, and let's give it a route of customers. You want to give your routes a name based on the resource that they are managing. In this case, we are working with the customer entity, so the appropriate resource is also the customer. We're going to give our route a name of customers because we want to always make our API routes in plural. The next step is going to be to create our request delegate, which is just a Lambda function implementing the body of our endpoint. We can use method injection here to get any services that we're going to need to implement our endpoint, and I'm going to inject the instance of iConfiguration so that I can access my connection string, which I added in the application settings JSON file. The connection string is going to be in this variable, and we're going to get the value by saying configuration get connection string, and we're going to get the default connection value. The connection string returned by this method could be null, so I'm going to solve that a little later on in the video. Right now, I'm just going to add a null forgiving operator. So I'm going to use var because it's obvious that this is returning a string. And then the next thing that we need to do with this connection string is to create the connection to our database. How you create a new connection is by saying new SQL connection. This class is available in the Microsoft Data SQL Client namespace, which is why we added the appropriate NuGet package. Now, if I pass the connection string to this constructor, it's going to establish a connection to my database. I also want to save this in a variable, and it's really important that I add a using statement in front of my connection so that it gets disposed when we go out of scope. I'm using an inline using statement here. You can also use the approach with a block. I prefer using the inline statement because I find it simpler. So the next step is going to be to write our SQL query. So what I like to do, and I find it more readable, is to define my SQL queries as constants. And let's write a simple query that's going to select everything from the customers table. So I'm going to write select star from customers, and this will be enough to return the data from the customers table. Select star in general is considered bad because you're going to query all of the columns from the table where you might only be using a few of them, but in our case, we really want all of the columns. So we're going to select all of them. An alternative approach would be to manually specify all of the columns, like saying first name, last name, email, and date of birth. This approach would be considered slightly better, but you can use whichever one you like. So now that we have our connection to the database and the query, we are ready to query the customers. So how do we do that with Dapper? We can do an asynchronous query, and we can say connection query async. This is the method that is available through the Dapper library. It's also generic, and we can specify what is the return type of this query. I'm going to specify our customer model, and we're just going to provide our SQL query, and Dapper will be able to execute this. Now, of course, you need to make your whole method asynchronous to be able to await this. And now we can just return our customers from this endpoint. I can say return results.ok and pass in the customers. With this in place, we should be able to run our API and see the endpoint that we created in the Swagger user interface, and then we're going to run it and see if we get back any customers from the database. Here's the Swagger UI for our API, and of course we have our onGetCustomers endpoint, and let's try it out and see if we get back our customers from the database. So if I execute this query, we're going to get back 2 customers that I created in the database. And now let's make a few small improvements to our design before we move on with the other endpoints. Before we add any more endpoints, here's what I'm going to do. I'll add a new folder, which I will call endpoints, and I'm going to add a new class inside, which I will call customer endpoints. Now this is going to be a static class, and I'll add a static method inside, which I will use to map my endpoint. So I'll call it map customer endpoints, and it's going to be an extension method on the endpoint route builder type. So let me find it. Let's give it the name of builder. And now I want to move my endpoint registration from the program CS file into my static method that I just created. So the map get is going to live here. I'll add the missing using statements, and I'm going to replace app with builder. So now everything should function the same, and we just need to map our endpoints from program.cs. So let's call map customer endpoints, and now everything is the same as we had it before, only our endpoints are scoped inside of the customer endpoints class. The next small improvement I want to make is about creating the SQL connection every time. I'm going to create a helper service, which I will place inside of the services folder, and I'm going to call it SqlConnectionFactory. So let's create the SqlConnectionFactory class, and what we're going to do here is just expose one method, which is going to return a SQL connection. We'll call it create, and all we're going to do is return a new SQL connection. Now, to be able to do this, we need to pass it a connection string. So I'm going to add a private read-only string, which is going to represent my connection string. Now I can pass this connection string to the SQL connection, and I also need to inject this connection string from the constructor. So with this in place, the SQL Connection Factory is ready. We need to register it with dependency injection. Because it has the connection string, which is unlikely to change, I'm going to add it as a singleton service. If we were saving any state which should be disposed, then using a singleton isn't a good idea. For example, if we were storing a SQL connection inside of this class, this is something that you wouldn't want to do because you would have an open long-lived connection to the database. So let's call add singleton. And here's the approach I'm going to take. I'm going to resolve a service provider, and we're going to use this service provider to get a service. Which service do I need? Well, I need the iConfiguration service. So I'm going to say service provider get required service of iConfiguration. Then I'm going to use this iConfiguration instance to get a connection string, and we're going to take the default connection like we had earlier, and now I need to store this in a variable, so let's call it connection string, and I can return a new SqlConnectionFactory instance and pass it the connection string. And I said we're going to take care of the case when this is null, so let's throw a new application exception as soon as we try to resolve the SqlConnectionFactory, and we're going to say the connection string is null. Alright, so this takes care of our SqlConnectionFactory, and now I can go ahead and update my endpoint and simplify all of this. So instead of using iConfiguration, I can take the SqlConnectionFactory. Let's give it a proper name, and we're going to get the connection using SqlConnectionFactory create. This slightly simplifies our endpoints, and we can only focus on writing our queries. So the next endpoint I'm going to create is going to be to fetch a single customer from the database. It's also going to be a get endpoint, and the route is going to be customers/ID. Now to specify a parameter which is coming from your route, you need to use these curly braces here and then provide the name of your parameter inside. And now in the request delegate, I can grab the ID which is coming from the route along with the SqlConnectionFactory, and we can write our query. So let's see what we're going to have inside. I'm going to actually copy what I have here because it's going to be really similar. I'm also going to make this asynchronous, and what we need to update in the body of this endpoint is to add a where statement to take care of selecting a customer with the given ID. So I'm going to use this approach for writing my query to make it a little bit more readable. So I'm going to place select here and all of the columns that we are selecting. Then we're going to say from customers, and I'm going to add a where statement in the end, which is going to say where the ID of the customer is equal to the customer ID that I'm going to pass as a parameter. Let's also update the query method that I'm using. I'm going to use the query single or default async method, and this one can return null, so we'll have to handle that case as well. We're going to still be passing the SQL statement as before, but now I also need to pass my parameter, which is the customer ID, and I'll give it the value coming from the route. I mentioned that the customer could be null, and of course this is now plural, so let's update this. So let's say if the customer is not null, then we're going to return an OK result. Otherwise, we're going to return results.notfound. And let's check out if this endpoint is working. Let's get all of the customers to see which ones we have in the database. And let's try to get the customer with the ID of 6. So I'll open up this endpoint. Let's pass the number 6, which is the ID of this customer and the route. And if I send this request, we're going to get back a single customer that we fetched using Dapper. If I pass in a non-existing customer ID, such as 11, we're going to get a 404 not found response. So everything is working correctly. And let's see what's going to be the next endpoint that we're going to add. Let's add an endpoint for creating a new customer. So we're going to say map post. Post is the HTTP verb that you should be using for creating resources in your API. We're going to use the route of customers. Then we need to define our request body. This is where our customer is going to come before we store it in the database. So let's also use the customer model directly, and I'll give it the name of customer, and I'm going to need the SqlConnectionFactory. So let's create the request body and see what we're going to do inside. So I need to start by opening a connection to my database. So we're going to say SqlConnectionFactory create. Then let's write a SQL statement for inserting a new customer to the database. So this one is going to be slightly different than what we had before. I'm going to say insert into customers, and then I'm going to specify the individual column names. The first column is going to be the first name, then we're going to have the last name, then I'll have the email and the date of birth. And then we need to provide the values for these columns, and I'm just going to copy all of these, paste them here, and we're going to make them parameters, which we are going to provide through Dapper. And then this is what our query will look like. I'll make this method asynchronous before writing the query, and then I can say await connection execute async because I'm not expecting any data back, and we're going to pass the SQL query, and I'm going to pass the entire customer object as our parameters. Now, because the names of the properties are identical to the parameters that I'm expecting in this query, everything is going to function the same. Otherwise, you're going to need to create an anonymous object and pass in the proper values to the Dapper parameters. Then we're going to say return results okay, and let's see if this is working correctly. Here's our post endpoint for creating a new customer. I'm going to omit the ID. Because this is part of my model, I really shouldn't be exposing it as part of my API. A much better approach would be to create a separate model without the ID, and it's only going to contain the required fields for creating a new customer. So let's give it the name of new customer. We're going to give it an email of new@test.com, and let's say that they were born on this day, which is July 27th in the year 2000. So let's send this request to our API, and we're going to get back a 200 OK response. So now if I check out my list of all customers, you're going to see that our new customer is there. If I try to query this customer by the ID, so I'm going to say give me the customer with the ID of 7, we're going to get back this customer from the database. So our post endpoint is working as expected. Let's now implement an endpoint for updating a customer. So I'm going to say builder map put, and I'm going to give it a route of customers/ID. I'm going to provide the ID for the customer that I will be updating in the route. It's going to be asynchronous, and I'll need the customer from my API, and I'll also need the SqlConnectionFactory so that I can write my queries using Dapper. Let's create the body for my endpoint. And inside of this body, I'm going to start by opening a connection to the database. I'll say SqlConnectionFactory create. Then I'm going to write my SQL query. It's also going to be similar to the one that we have for inserting to the database. I'm going to say update customers, and then I'll say set, and we're going to say which columns we are setting. So we're going to set the first name to the respective parameter, and the same is going to apply to the other columns that we have in the database. So let's also update the date of birth, and I'm actually going to align these vertically so that you can see everything. So we're only left with date of birth. I also need to make sure to not update all of the rows in my database, so it's really important to specify a where statement here, and we're going to say where the ID is equal to the ID which will come as a parameter. Now I can say await connection execute async, pass in the customer, which already contains the same properties that are matching my parameters, so this is going to work okay, and I'm going to return results.noContent as the response. Before we can try this, I omitted one small part, and that is that the customer ID will come from the route, so I'll add it here. So ID is going to come from the route, and then I'm going to set the ID property on my customer to the one coming from the route. In a proper solution, you would have a separate class for the request for updating a customer, which would not contain the ID, and you would pass it through the route. In this case, I'm resorting to a small hack, but let's see if this is working correctly. I'm going to update the customer with the ID of 7, and let me grab the existing data from the database. So this is what we have right now, and let's use it in our put endpoint. So let's pass the ID of 7. I'll also omit the ID from the request body, and I'm going to say that this is a new name for this customer. Let's send this request, and we get back a 204 no content. Now let's try to fetch the same customer from the database, and you can see that the first name of the customer was updated through our put endpoint. One more thing that's left to do is to create an endpoint for deleting a customer. We're going to call map delete. The route will be customers, and we're going to grab the ID from the route. It's going to be an async method, and I'll take the ID from the route and the SqlConnectionFactory. So let's define our endpoint body, and this one is going to be slightly simpler than what we had so far. So let's first create our SQL database connection by calling SqlFactory create. Then our SQL query is going to be a delete statement. So I will say delete from customers, where the customer ID is equal to the customer ID that I will pass as a parameter to this query. Now let's say connection execute async. I'll pass in the SQL query and an anonymous object containing my customer ID. And now I can just return results.noContent. Let's check out if our delete endpoint is working correctly. Let's first try to get the customer with the ID of 7 from the database, and you'll see that we get a response back. Now I'm going to try to delete it through our delete endpoint, and we get back a 204 no content, so we assume that it was deleted. So let's try to fetch the customer again through the get endpoint, and you'll see that we get a 404 not found response, which means that the customer was successfully deleted from the database. One more improvement that you can make here when you are mapping your endpoints is to create a route group. You can do this by calling the endpoint route builder and call the map group endpoint, where you specify the route prefix for the entire group. Then you can say group builder here, or just group to make it simple, and you have to map your endpoints using the route group builder. So I will just replace builder with my route group builder on all of my endpoints, and I also need to remove the customer's prefix to get rid of the common part in all of the routes. And now my routes are slightly simpler, and I can apply any cross-cutting concerns on the group itself, such as adding authorization, rate limiting. I can also add an endpoint filter, which is a way to apply middleware with minimal APIs. So route groups are a nice feature that you can use on top of minimal APIs to make them just slightly less complicated. So this is how to create a simple CRUD API using Dapper, and you can see how little code we need to implement a complete CRUD functionality. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to subscribe to my channel, and until next time, stay awesome.